So when it comes to sports, I tend to be a traditionalist. For you baseball fans out there, I am against the DH. I'm against interleague play. At the beginning of Women's History Month, I put something up on social media about this all-women sports league called Athletes Unlimited. I actually posted an article in Sports Illustrated written by Emma Bacciolieri about this new all-female sports league. As someone who always considered himself a feminist, but regardless of that, someone who considers himself an egalitarian human being and a sports fan and a ball fan, I would like to just do my part to talk about this league and spread the word. When we think of the teams in the NBA, in the NFL, in the MLB, in the NHL as competing with each other, which they are on the field, on the ice, on the court, but the owners, the 30 principal owners in Major League Baseball, for instance, are not fiscal adversaries. They are 30 partners within the monopolistic business that is Major League Baseball. So how does a new league compete for market share? How do they compete with these leagues that, in the case of Major League Baseball, have had around 150 years head start to corner the market? You can't. You can't compete on their turf. You have to reinvent the wheel. There are, perhaps among others, 3 things for sure that a fledgling sport or league needs in order to be successful and survive and thrive. One is statistics, something by which you can measure success and greatness. You really want to talk about fandom or wonkish nature of people who really get into the weeds of something they're passionate about. Baseball statistics. There's no limit to the depth of weeds that you can sink into in terms of measuring greatness in baseball. A second thing that is essential is marketing. Now, obviously, that's self-explanatory. Now, a third element is gambling. Now, I personally do not want to champion gambling. I think that people should have the freedom to make their own decisions, but I'm not going to champion gambling. But gambling is actually very important for the success, certainly of a fledgling sport or athletic league. Gambling allows for the intense interest in that sport of people who otherwise do not have a particular interest in that particular sport or in sports in general. So to set the stage for Athletes Unlimited, okay, we have to go farther back as we must for a better understanding of anything regarding today. Baseball is the American version, the American evolution of several ball and bat sports that originated in England, of which rounders and cricket are only 2. The earliest evidence within the written, published word of something akin to baseball in this hemisphere is from the 1600s. Over a century and a half, baseball got very popular, developing along its own American lines, its own American rules, even in slightly different regions. Even in the mid-1800s, there were 2 dominant variations of baseball, the Massachusetts game and the New York game, whose rules varied slightly. For instance, in the Massachusetts game, you could actually throw the ball at the base runner, and if you hit him, he was out. Now, the Massachusetts game did not survive. It's the New York game that survived. And come the early-ish mid-1800s, it proliferated among men who had enough means, so businessmen, lawyers, doctors, who had the means to enjoy free time. Instead of going to the gymnasium, which at the time may have had fencing, wrestling, for instance, or horse racing, which required much more money and much more means, they took to what was a game of their youth, which is baseball, and call them crazy. Back then, a lot of people did. They realized that getting outside in the urban sprawl in places like New York City to run the bases, physically exert yourself, was healthy for you. You developed clubs. So think of the YMCA or some type of intramural sports associations. For instance, the New York Gothams, the Brooklyn Eagles, the New York Knickerbockers, which became the most famous and the most influential of these pre-league organizations of men just gathering in clubs to play the recreation that was baseball. If you do enough research, you can find published interviews of some of these men in their later years at the turn of the 20th century. If we're talking in the 1840s, that was the pinnacle of these organizations. You can read them talking about how, yeah, they realized that they needed more space. Urban development was getting too intense downtown, so they had to go out into the boondocks of 23rd Street and Broadway in Manhattan. Or after that, venturing even further out into the sticks of 34th Street and Broadway, 7th Avenue, 6th Avenue, what today is Herald Square. But one of the most fascinating stimuli for the development of organized baseball is pandemic. Cholera. Cholera back then was something that seemed to return to major urban centers every decade and a half or 20 years or so. So by the early to mid 1800s, certainly by 1840s, New Yorkers were scared of the return of cholera, which proliferated in urban centers, before they realized that it had to do with the water they were all sharing. And so Hoboken, New Jersey, was the destination that the Knickerbockers went to have an open field view of the city, not too far across the river, but where they could freely play in an open field, unmolested by urban elements of congestion, of disease, and overpopulation. The proliferation of these organizations, these intramural baseball clubs like the Knickerbockers, for instance, led to the agreement among national clubs to codify rules. And that was also done in New York City at a convention in the 1850s. That led to the National Association of Amateur Baseball Players. What happens then is evolution. Among this huge group of amateurs, there are clearly certain players that are far and above the quality of the vast majority. What happens then? You have organizers who realize that people are coming to these games now and that they can monetize the fact that they're playing. The charging of admission is something that started in Queens. They converted, I believe, a racetrack. We're talking in the 1850s, 1860s now, and converted it because it has the fence. Before, baseball didn't have any fence. There was no boundary between the public and the player. It is now incumbent upon you to have the best players available. You have to start paying them. So now what happens is that professionalism is closeted You have certain teams that are allegedly amateur like the rest, but the reality is the person that runs, the people that runs these clubs are paying them under the table for their superior skills. That leads to the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, who are the first out professional baseball team. No one's mincing any words. These are paid professionals. They're going to show you a hell of a baseball game, and they go on tour. And what happens now is that leads to the first professional league around 1871, which collapses 5 years later. The National League in 1876 is formed, and the National League exists today as one of the two major leagues of Major League Baseball. The American League didn't come till 1901. Major League Baseball, the perhaps oldest in the world of all professional sports leagues like it, has obviously cornered the market on professional baseball. So how does a new league compete for market share? How do they compete with these leagues that, in the case of Major League Baseball, have had around 150 years head start to corner the market on your sport, especially if you're softball? And the creators of Athletes Unlimited realized that you can't. You can't compete on their turf. You have to come up with something else. You have to come up, even if it's the same sport, the same thing going on at a micro level, at a macro level, you have to reinvent the wheel. So Athletes Unlimited, no owners, one location where all the games are played, marketing by social media, so you don't have to come up with the exorbitant amount of overhead capital just to get your word out. And in today's day and age, you can do that. You have enough young women and girls and their parents and men, yes, following softball on television, following individual players who are a ripe potential audience for the next stage in those players' journey. So what happens in Athletes Unlimited is that you have the same pool of players over the entire season with, I think it's around a handful of captains selected by the powers that be in the league, every week drafting and selecting players for their own team. And that itself, the draft weekly, is treated as an event to see what individual players, what individual stars are going to align this week and face each other in competition. It's the statistics, it's the measurable success and greatness and accomplishment of all the individual players that is the alpha and omega of success of the season, as opposed to a team winning it all. The stars that you're following, their success, who is the top in this category, the top in this category, the top in the other category, that is the measure of greatness by which fans and, dare we say, gamblers are measuring the success of the season. So you don't have to accumulate a group of billionaires who are all going to agree on the boundaries and the commercial aspects of this league. You don't have the labor force, which is what everyone's coming to see, bound to owners who obviously have fiscal interests. Even though they're all so rich, no one is getting into professional sports ownership to make money anymore. That ended probably by the 1980s. Owning a professional sports team in one of the major professional leagues is simply sexy. It's awesome. You're in an exclusive club of 30 people in the world that have ownership over that sport. To no longer have the product beholden to those powers that be, it's revolutionary. And it makes sense because there is not that exorbitant overhead. You don't need 30 different stadia in 30 different cities in 30 different markets that you have to wrestle from sports teams and leagues that are already there and have been there in some cases for 100 years. So let's say your team loses a game. Obviously, you're trying to win, you're trying to play, but the loss only matters during the duration of the game, which in a world of streaming everything, sports is still the jackpot of live attention and appointment viewing. So that's baked in. People want to see the outcome of the game. So you still have the maintenance, the maintaining, the preservation of the integrity of competition. This is an exciting new circumstance in which the integrity of the game is preserved, but they are reinventing the wheel in terms of norms, in terms of our very concept of team competition, in order to carve out space for more opportunity and for the women's game to proliferate. And I think it's very exciting. It's just the dawn of this venture, just like a lot of things we take for granted now in professional sports that are dominated by men. We're not foregone conclusions. Over a century and a half plus, there has been evolution and change based on the times, based on the natural evolution of things. So it's exciting to be at the dawn of this new female women's venture, and I'm excited to see where it goes. Athletes Unlimited. Check it out.